Everyone and everything dies, my usual cheery introduction, and most things are better left dead once they've achieved it. Yet we, as a society, are so creatively and intellectually bankrupt that we're obsessed with reanimating corpses, because creating new things is both more difficult and more expensive than stringing up the rotting dead. This is true in almost all walks of life, from politics to culture. The United States is currently run by a low-level Draugr and Imhotep's bride, while in the UK, our next Prime Minister is going to be chosen by a few thousand Conservative Party members who are so old they might as well be extras in The Walking Dead. In the arts, we continually resurrect the corpses of dead franchises that really should have stayed in the ground, or keeping them on life support when the kindest thing would be to let them shuffle off this mortal coil. There is absolutely no reason to make an Alien prequel exploring the meaning of fucking life. Indiana Jones will shortly shuffle out on a Zimmer frame and it will be very embarrassing. Jean-Luc Picard has the complexion and the charisma of a zombie, but he's getting a third season. The MCU absolutely refuses to go gently into that good night, though it would have been more dignified if it had. Jurassic World is a play park for cultural necrophiles. Star Wars has not only been killed by modern writers, but they now insist on buggering its innocents like Jimmy Savile on Open Day at the Children's Hospital. High on the list of these crimes against art, culture, and decency is what we are obliged to call the Predator franchise. Properly defined, there are only 2 films in the Predator franchise, and all the rest is depravity with dead things. The original is deservedly a cult classic. The second, well, they tried something. It wasn't an abject failure. But after that, Aliens vs. Predator, Aliens vs. Predator Requiem, Predators, The Predator. These all chart a Targaryen-style decline from the beautiful to genocide and incest. Contra those few weirdos in our comment section who seem to think I'm angry and upset when I criticize these things, I actually very much enjoy taking apart awful movies, and so I was positively salivating at the prospect of reviewing Prey, the new Predator prequel on Hulu, which seemed from all the rumours and interviews and announcements before its launch to have decided enough damage had been done sequentially, and so it was time to do a George Lucas and go cock up the before times, ticking the boxes labelled diversity and strong female character, and drawing a big crude cartoon penis on the box labelled good story. So, like almost anything else produced in the last 5 years. But was it as bad as all that? The answer is yes. Well, actually no. But yes. No, then yes. The story, there will be spoilers by the way, follows a young Elizabeth Warren who lives with a tribe in a village and who is oppressed by the patriarchy, which I thought was just a white settler colonialist construct, but apparently the Native Americans had it too. She wants to go hunting, but she is told she can't because she is a woman. Here is a sample of the dialogue. It is a representative sample of the dialogue.
Why do you want to hunt? Because you all think that I can't.
And this is one of those lines that fills you with dread. An irony of the Boko Haram lot is that they'll happily lecture you on the crimes of colonialism while leaving absolutely no area of history untouched by their colonialist imposition of modern Western politics. Cheap jibes by her male hunting companions about not needing a cook, the patronising "but she knows medicine" make for a distinctly unpromising start. But, anyway, in terms of the plot, they are out hunting lions. As an aside, even in the first few minutes of the film, there are some truly stunning location shots. Mountains, hills, lush forests, and not a green screen in sight. Prey has a very different, more real and more naturalistic feel from the off than any of the recent sequels. It has been set in the world, rather than having a world being created for it. Speaking of which, it does actually take the time to set its scene and recreate this world. I can't comment on its accuracy. I know very little about the Native Americans except that they didn't put up much of a fight the last time I played Empire Total War. Others will be best placed to judge. I will simply say, for the purposes of this review, and acknowledging my position of ignorance, that the film does a solid if not spectacular job in this aspect of its world building. Its ancillary characters are more than a little bit boilerplate, and they're not helped by some truly questionable acting, though of course we don't really watch Predator films for the Olivier-caliber performances. But the world is deepened in some satisfying ways by the little things, details, like the creation of tools from plants and sticks and stones, that does make it seem as though some research and care has gone into the recreation of the Native American way of life. The opening sees Elizabeth Warren out hunting deer with her dog sidekick, who we will call Big Chief Good Boy. In the sky, she sees a sign that she and her people call... Yep, they're not even joking. Her and her people, they call the sign the Thunderbird, which, yeah, that was a bit distracting because I kept imagining International Rescue swooping down in Thunderbird 2. And in the event there is a ship swooping down from the sky, but it is the Predator's ship. In their mythology, however, the arrival of Thunderbird 2, the Thunderbird, is a sign which she, Elizabeth Warren that is, interprets as indicating that it is her time to prove herself as a hunter. This sets her off with some other young hunters who cannot act and have no personality to speak of, but none of them like her, except maybe her brother, and even he only reluctantly agrees to take her along. The film cuts away in the middle of this sequence to make what I think has to be considered a mistake in showing us the Predator early on. Now, there are two schools of thought when making films like this, and most people, influenced by the success of Aliens, seem to be of the opinion that the only way to build on films like Alien and Predator is to shift the genre and do something entirely new. And broadly, I do agree with that, but this does not in fact entail doing away with every aspect of the original. Aliens, like Jaws 2, which is not great but not abysmal, certainly nowhere near as good as Aliens, retains some of the features of its progenitor film, principally in keeping the aliens themselves hidden for large portions of the film, including several of the action sequences. The destruction of the Marines happens largely off-screen, with only snatched glimpses of the attacking creatures. The hallway scene with the turrets is likewise implied presence rather than shown presence. Aliens did not forego the utility of stealth, of silence, of darkness, of jump scares. Its action sequences where the aliens are present are effective for their contrast, which would have been lost had they been present in the film from the off. Likewise, Predator. Just because the audience knows all about the Predator doesn't mean its old tricks are not still effective from a dramatic and narrative point of view. So when we see it, cloaked admittedly but unmistakably there, and it stabs a snake through the head within the first 10 minutes and skins it, the film has here chosen to forego an attempt at replicating the menace through absence technique that made the original film so effective. I don't think that was necessary, and I don't think it's particularly good that they've chosen to dispense with it. But if a sequel or a prequel does choose to make a hard genre break, harder than Aliens even, it then places much more emphasis on the foundational techniques of its new genre. Aliens, like Terminator 2, is a brilliant action film. Prey then has to show equivalent skill and deftness with whatever genre it's chosen to replace the first one, and we will come back to that, I'm sure. The opening is, in general, a wonderfully shot but pretty superficial thing. There isn't very much to say about its plot, which is why I'm dovetailing through all these other considerations. What triumphs it has in the field of world building are brought down by questionable characters and too many stock, cliché and distinctly modern interactions. Besides those already mentioned, it's quickly revealed that Elizabeth Warren is, in fact, good at medicine, as they stumble across one of their fellow hunters who has been wounded by the lion they are hunting. But the same comrades who told us she was good at medicine in the preceding scene then spend much of the next several scenes questioning every one of her decisions, arguing with her, pushing back against all her suggestions, all of which is done on a character level to drive home the point that she is unconventional, she is fighting against prejudice, she has a point to prove. It's a shame, though, that some of the subtleties present in the filmic technique aren't extended to the writing, because we've already got this point, and this just contradicts established character. It's also proceeding at a fair rate of knots through its opening 20 minutes, which is usually a sign either of a very limited runtime, or of its writers being over-eager to get to the bit they are actually interested in. The film deserves credit for using these opening scenes to actually show us most of Elizabeth Warren's skills, something an awful lot of modern media is completely incapable of. Think Batwoman as a prime example. It's a prime example of most shit things in writing, where in one episode it's explained in dialogue that she's a crack shot, because later in that same episode she is required to be a crack shot. The same thing happens in Hawkeye, where it is explained in dialogue that Kate Bishop is an ace martial artist and fencer. In the same episode she later needs to go and deploy those same skills. Show not tell is usually preferable, and Prey does warrant praise for taking this approach. But the effect is a little bit undermined by the very formulaic and very speedy way it opts to show us these things. They find an injured man and she heals him. They find the snake from earlier, skinned. Her tracking skills tell her the prints aren't from a bear or a lion, which information, no other exploration or interrogation of the scene occurs by the way, is sufficient for her to become so alarmed that she has to run off and find her brother. She traces the tracks and seems to be on to something, then is grabbed by her brother, where they exchange perfunctory dialogue, in which she reiterates, and reiterates again, that the thing they're hunting isn't what they think it is. She has an argument with another arsehole, everyone except her brother and herself is an arsehole, and her brother takes her side on the whole stunning and brave and fiercely independent strong woman can hunt thing. So you can be reasonably sure he'll die, in order to give her the revenge motive, and the payoff when her inevitable victory occurs. This is all fine, but it happens so quickly that it does appear distinctly unsubtle. A happens to get to B, to get to C, to get to D without interruption or intermission. Strange tracks, hunting something weird, finds brother attacked by a lion, gets knocked out, wakes up at home. She receives a moral lesson about hunting being secondary to survival. I wonder if that will become relevant later. Though this is procedural, it is at least consistent. Scenes do follow scenes in logical order and progression, even if they are quite shallow. And again, this is pleasing when you compare it to the huge number of modern cinematic offerings which fail to do this most simple of writing tasks. But, ideally, for this to be a truly good film, as opposed to a merely average or passable one, you would want a little bit more than the mere superficial point-by-point-by-point style writing device. I should say, though, if it weren't already apparent, that this film is, so far, much better than I was expecting it to be. How very disappointing. Besides having a story that, though threadbare, has so far made a fair amount of sense, its combination of excellent location shots, some nifty camera work, an understated yet effective soundtrack, a fairly fleshed out world, and its steady if unspectacular setting up of a mystery, all makes it a much more serious and engrossing film than any Predator entry, arguably since the first one. The only thing in the opening third that consistently lets it down is the dialogue, the constant harking back to Elizabeth Warren saying, "I'm ready for this," and some arsehole man saying, "You're not ready for this." Yeah, we get the point. Film, Elizabeth Warren is strong and brilliant, she's unfairly put upon, she will get to prove herself, we will all clap. Just move on from this now. This is a shame, because Prey doesn't have recourse to the other thing that made the original so entertaining, which is a full cast of characters. Elizabeth Warren is the focus of this story. Everyone else is ancillary. It's setting up a one-on-one battle with the Predator, a fight to survive, isolated in the wilderness. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this approach, but it does require that you actually flesh out your one main character, because we actually have to relate to her. She has to hold our attention. We have to invest in her. And we're not easily able to do this because the film doesn't seem all that interested in her itself. It's interested in her as a device, as an excuse for the plot to happen, and as an excuse to make its point about strong women. Which, yeah, fine, but the most interesting strong women also have characters behind them, and so far Elizabeth Warren does not. And this is a shame because there is just enough in her, just about, to make you want to learn more. The absence of further character development and deeper conversations with her fellow tribesmen is felt. The other significant weakness as we move into the middle act is the Predator itself, which, I have to say again, we are seeing too much of, and never in any scene that really accomplishes anything. In the original, we know the Predator is there. We have its POV shots, we have its thermal vision. But we only get one snatched corner of the eye vague hint of movement in the jungle until pretty late on in the film. It takes out the majority of the main cast without ever being seen. The point isn't total absence. The point is, we know something is there, but we don't know what that is. Save that it's deadly. It's picking off one of the most elite, effective, and lethal Spec Ops teams in the world, one by one, without apparently too much fuss. In Prey's first half, we get the occasional thermal cam shot, but this is made largely redundant because we then invariably see the Predator itself, cloaked but clearly visible, and rather than picking off elite warriors, all it's doing is going around punching random animals in the face. Taking out a little wolf on the prairie is not the same as taking out a goddamn sexual tyrannosaur. The Predator is also a trophy hunter, as we know, but I seem to recall the first film establishing that it is fairly picky about the trophies it takes. It doesn't go around beheading random animals, it picks strong warriors. It tests itself. We can ask, but probably shouldn't, what it's doing in the American wilderness when the strongest warriors of the day were to be found in Europe and Asia. You can ask that question of its presence in Val Verde, which is essentially the Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam surrogate in the original film. But the context there is that this is a crux point, a hinge moment, a center point in world combat. There are plenty of skilled fighters to challenge itself against. Russians and American commandos are both there, drawn by the Cold War, and there are also a lot of definitely not Vietnamese guerrillas. Now the counter-argument may be, well, we don't just want Prey to mimic the original film, following a group of strong men and watching the Predator defeat them. That is, though, undeniably an effective device, and choosing not to replay it is only half the equation. Choosing what to do instead is the more important half. And opting to have just one main character, thereby forcing the Predator to spend the opening half of the film going around gutting wolves and snakes, just isn't as effective as a replacement. There are other things you could have done. For example, you could have married these two approaches. Keep your protagonist isolated, keep it a single character journey, but build up the Predator by having it attack off-screen and by rumor if necessary, the strongest warriors in her tribe or a neighbouring tribe, rather than going around punching dogs. But the key I think there is A, have it off-screen full-time, and B, have it attack something which could, at least by implication, fight back. Sticking with counter-arguments for a moment, one you sometimes hear against the need to keep the Predator absent and silent is that the audience already knows all about it, so what's the point in keeping it hidden? This, I think, though, is a silly argument, because it doesn't account for immersion. Again, Aliens didn't entirely dispense with the techniques of Alien. The same claim has been made of Jaws. If, though, as a writer of these sequels or prequels, you assume that the audience will expect to see the Predator, you are stressing the audience's pre-existing knowledge and assuming that that pre-existing knowledge counteracts any argument from immersion. But this just isn't true. If you construct your world, your story, and especially your characters compellingly, your goal is to place the audience in the mind of your protagonist, to see through their eyes and to think through their brain. Immersion requires the suspension of disbelief, and the suspension of disbelief entails a sacrifice of prior knowledge. Yes, we might in one corner of our mind know what the Predator is and what it does and that it's there, but the ideal should surely be to compel us to forget that as best we can for the sake of the story being told. There is no rule that states you must break immersion to account for prior knowledge. Immersion ideally should subordinate prior knowledge. You could portray the Predator using precisely the same suspenseful techniques of the original, and the story would have been better for it, and the audience would have forgiven it, and probably, I would argue, enjoyed it significantly more. Showing us the Predator early on is a nudge-wink to the audience. It's telling the audience, yeah, you and I know what's going on, but these people on the screen you're watching don't, the effect of which is to drive the audience out of the world on the screen, rather than inviting them into it. So, a mixed bag so far, but though I'm complaining, I do feel the need to stress that, notwithstanding the disappointment at finding myself having to dole out praise, this film really is a pleasant surprise thus far. Though the initial hunt sequence does tease the presence of the Predator, and Elizabeth Warren is convinced there's something out in the forest beyond the lion, the culmination of this sequence is, in fact, the culmination of the hunt for the lion, which attacks her while she's squatting on a tree. She falls off and bangs her head, and passes out, then wakes up in bed and learns her brother killed the lion, rescued her, and carried her home, which is of course proof that she's just not cut out for this, so she should probably settle for being a good little housewife and get back to the cooking. But she's still convinced there's more to her than that, and she's still convinced there's something new and mysterious out there in the forest somewhere, so she goes off following the trail. Now there is a piece of Predator-related confusion in the next scene, which becomes more relevant later on. The Predator has an established habit of killing random animals and leaving them around for people to find, including, or so we're led to believe because of the parallels with the snake, a whole field of bison at one point, which does look faintly cartoonish, but it's not as clear as perhaps the film would or should wish it to be, whether it is doing this to bait out our protagonist, and if so why, or just to bait any random hunter, or just because it's bored, or indeed whether this is in fact the chain of events at all. But at the moment we have no reason to suppose that it was anyone other than the Predator who went around killing and skinning bison, so I think I thought I saw when I first watched it, what the film was going for, which is an inversion of the established relationship. Here the Predator isn't merely hunting, it is inviting a hunt, in much the same way our Indian friends here would bait out a predator. It's just that the delivery is somewhat lacking and confusing, and will be undercut quite significantly later on in a way that makes the narrative make significantly less sense. But flawed though the delivery may be, the concept is a solid one. It's intriguing, a mutual hunt with two warriors in a decaying orbit getting ever closer to each other. And once this film does take Elizabeth Warren away from the tribe, so freeing us of the awful dialogue and the bad acting, we get to inhabit and appreciate both her character a little more, and the world she inhabits significantly more still. The approach it takes here puts one at least a little bit in mind of The Revenant, or even Red Dead Redemption, with a heavy emphasis on location and the dangers and brutality of nature, and the joys and difficulty of exploring unspoiled lands. We even have a fight with a bear, albeit with some questionable CGI and a bit of jarring teleportation. The predator then appears, again a bit cartoonishly, appears to beat the bear in full view of Elizabeth Warren, and then she escapes it by swimming off down a river. Unfortunately, the film still suffers from stolid character development and an almost episodic approach to plot in which subsequent scenes don't really carry the weight of preceding scenes. Elizabeth Warren has just seen a translucent monster outlined in the blood of a huge bear it held above its head for no very good reason, but in the next scene she's just mildly pissed off that her clothes got a bit damp. And then in the next scene, she runs into some more awful actors. And it's not just that she can't convey to them what she's seen, it's that she doesn't seem to have been impacted at all by what she's seen. It's just another thing. It's proof of her contention that there is something new in the forest, but without any emotional or conceptual or psychological significance to that proof. It logically vindicates her, but it leaves no mark on her or indeed on anyone around her, which is partly a failure of acting, but much more a failure of the writers. You'd think if you'd just seen some random space alien covered in blood, that might have, produced a bit of a shock response. And it really can't be overstated just how bad as actors some of these ancillary tribesmen are. They've clearly been written minimalistically to appear normal, but it does actually take some talent to act normal, and none of the secondary cast has that talent. They are distractingly bad, and so it comes as a relief when the Predator appears again and unceremoniously yeets them from existence, which we don't really care about because they aren't characters, they're just props, and they've not been established as especially fearsome or skillful, meaning we don't get the same fear factor as when, in the original, the Predator dispatches people shown in its first act to be near unbeatable man-monsters. Elizabeth Warren bumps into a more sympathetic tribesman in a field while running away from the Predator. They both run away from the Predator, and it, cartoonishly yet again, kills him in a wide shot with just a spurt of blood. This, combined with the fact that Elizabeth Warren is still running for her life and doesn't look back once, and combined with the fact that in the next scene she runs into some evil, hairy colonizers who knock her out, makes what really should have been an impactful death an airy, weightless, again cartoony thing of very little consequence. And then, because in the next scene she's imprisoned by evil, hairy colonizers who are strange and alien in their own right, we're compelled to forget all about what just happened in the field. But this happens so often makes the entire thing seem disconnected. The plot does follow logically, for the most part, but none of the connective tissue is there. Events happen as an excuse to get from point A to point B, but none of them really has a point in and of themselves. You could say this is minimalist storytelling, but that does only go so far as an excuse. Character is supposed to be formed in response to events. When characters have no response to events on an emotional or a psychic level, they aren't really characters at all. Which is a shame, as I keep saying, because in other ways the film is quite clever at what it does. I'm not sure if it's just the copy I watched. If it is, please disregard. But in the version I watched, most of the evil hairy colonizers speak in a foreign tongue and there are no subtitles. Only one of them, the only sympathetic character, is able to speak to Elizabeth Warren. He speaks many languages, he explains. Of the rest, their imposing size, the fact they are invariably shot from a low angle, their beastly expressions and mannerisms, all combine to drive home the sense of an invasive culture shock, and that is actually quite well done. But again, the film doesn't really marry these clever devices to its plot very well. These people are here to give an imposing impression, but it's left to the vaguely sympathetic polyglot one to cram these new characters into the story with some formulaic exposition, suggesting they know about the Predator as well and they are hunting it, or at least they are aware of it. It's revealed that they are the ones who skilled all the bison and not the Predator. which is just odd. This doesn't add anything to the story, except doing away with some knowledge we thought we had. And to add a contrivance to something that was already a little bit hard to reconcile, they have her brother captive, and they torture him. Now, I think what the film is attempting to depict here is their alien similarities with the Predator. It is an invasive alien species, so are these people. But the film has a hazy relationship with subtlety, so it doesn't do this particularly well, and it doesn't spend much time on it at all before we get a jump cut to the next scene, where they've gone from being in a lush forest to one that seems to have been burned. Quite significantly burned. Though of course if it had been, wouldn't they have all spotted it? They've tied Elizabeth Warren and her brother to a burned stump in a bid to lure the Predator out, even though none of them is hiding and several are sitting on loud horses, and none of them are very far away, meaning they're all in plain view, which you'd think rather defeats the object of baiting a trap. And of course the Predator comes around behind them and somehow manages to gut all the horsemen without the snipers, who aren't more than 10 feet away from them, hearing anything at all, which is all kinds of silly. This is not how the Predator is meant to operate, because the most skillful hunter in the world couldn't kill so many people in such close proximity so quickly without anyone noticing or hearing a single sound. It's just implausible. Elizabeth Warren does some hasty exposition, working out with very little evidence indeed, that the Predator won't kill them while they're tied to a tree because it doesn't hunt that way and it doesn't see them as a threat. So she and Brother Warren begin concocting a plan, and we get the film's first, thankfully, because it's a fucking terrible idea to do this, its first direct reference to the original.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
Because member Predator, member Arnie, member the line? Where this film has been unquestionably good, it's been due to its confidence in not doing these kinds of callbacks to the original film. It has, imperfectly, but it has at least, striven to be original in its own right. This kind of memberberry shit is degrading and distracting. Honestly, it's increasingly feeling like this would have been a much better film had they cut all the dialogue and made it completely silent, because the dialogue has been consistently awful throughout. And unfortunately, the film as a whole appears to be losing its way as we come toward the close. It hasn't so far done that thing common to many modern films in resorting to stupidity to move the plot along. But here, it does, as the Predator randomly walks on a big metal snare trap thing, which it has no excuse to do because it's walking on barren, scorched earth, and the trap isn't camouflaged or hidden in anything. And this is the cue for some more evil hairy colonizers to leap out of hiding. Apparently the Predator didn't bother scouting the area with its thermal vision, despite having taken out the sniper position earlier and having ample opportunity to scout the land below. The evil hairy colonizers trip it over and throw a net on it, but it escapes. Its armor is equipped with a little round metal shield thing, and at one stage, it faces down an entire group of the evil hairy colonizers, and it just stands there while they obligingly shoot at the fucking shield, despite its head, most of its torso, and all of its legs being unguarded. Fucking French morons. And the scene where it slaughters them all is, as always seems to be the case where we get to see the Predator do anything in this film, cartoonish. The doubly disappointing thing is that the first half of the fight happens off-screen while Elizabeth Warren and her brother try to get free of the tree stump, and the scene could have been so much more effective, not to mention saved valuable seconds, had it not flashed back to the action scene. As when the Predator kills Billy in the original, off-screen violence can sometimes be much more effective than on-screen fight scenes and decapitations. And we only have more reasons to regret it cutting back to the action because it gets progressively more dumb until it reaches an exquisitely awful nadir. The Predator walks toward an evil hairy colonizer who has had time to load his pistol, and he points it at the Predator's face. We have reason to believe the Predator could not survive a hit to the face, hence its shield. It walks toward the man and the man just points his gun at it. He doesn't fire. The Predator comes to a stop right in front of him, and eventually the evil hairy colonizer does pull the trigger, and the gun backfires and he shoots himself in the face. Jesus fuck film, this is tonally bonkers. It's gone from pretending at Revenant-style realism to Pirates of the Caribbean-style farce. And it's such a shame, because Though flawed in many ways, the film has actually been admirably consistent in tone until this point. It's presented itself as a serious thing, and it's treated its audience seriously. That's precisely what made it quite effective, despite its issues. But this scene just adds all kinds of fucking silly, and it is a real waste, because it feels as though the writers have expended an awful lot of effort only to discard it all for a cheap laugh. An awful lot more evil, hairy colonizers then appear from nowhere, shielded by smoke from the massive forest fire nobody has noticed happening, and they too obligingly shoot at the Predator's tiny shield before it hops through the trees and escapes, but not before dropping a ridiculous bomb, perhaps one of the most ridiculous designs for a bomb I've seen in some considerable time. You might remember how, in the original, the Predator's final act is to prime its self-destruct mechanism and blow a huge hole in the forest. It's simple, but it's effective. The countdown drives up tension as Arnie runs away. Will he make it out in time? But this bomb, this is just fucking silly. It has a timer, which is fine, but when the timer runs out, it doesn't explode. Instead, it opens, and 3 smaller bombs float out of it, and they just kind of sit there for a while in midair with no timer, like kind of anti-gravity Beyblades, and then they randomly fly off and explode. Why not just use a normal fucking bomb, you idiot? Who the hell designed this? What possible use is there for a timer on a box to release bombs that don't operate on timers? Elizabeth Warren and her brother make it to another evil hairy colonizer camp where it's bright sunshine again, and there's no smoke, and the forest is notably unburned. And there they rescue Big Chief Goodboy, and Elizabeth Warren beats the shit out of some Frenchman. As an Englishman, I am obliged to approve. The Predator, meanwhile, is patching itself up in another callback to the original film. And then there is a brief standoff back at the camp as Nice Guy Translator from earlier turns up, without a leg, and asks Elizabeth Warren for help, which she provides. He gives her his gun and tells her how to use it, rather than loading it himself. Now you might think he has to tell her because she refuses to give it back to him in case he should use it against her. But she does give it back in order for him to show her how to load it, which makes no fucking sense. His explanation too is so quick and complex, and to use a pun, scattergun, that it's frankly implausible that a Native American girl who's never seen nor held one of these things before should have been able to follow anything he was saying. Firearms in that day and age were incredibly complex things that had to be manually loaded after each shot, after all, involving a multi-step procedure that actually takes a good deal of time, knowledge, skill, and patience to get right. If I struggled to follow his explanation for how to load it, I can't imagine how she could possibly have followed it. Anyway, the Predator then follows them to the camp and Elizabeth Warren hides behind a tree, which is just a thing you can do now. She gave Nice Translator Guy some of the medicine from earlier that she used on the injured hunter, that is explained, earlier, drops body temperature. Consequently, the Predator doesn't see the man lying on the floor until it fucking steps on him, and then he makes a fuss, and so it kills him. Now this is all very silly, but praise where it's due. The writers have at least justified the mechanic. It is a little bit obvious, but at least they haven't just invented it on the spot as happens so often in films these days. The medicine, and its effect, was deployed and established respectively in one of the first scenes in the film, so here is the payoff. The problem is, the payoff itself isn't handled all that well. At least in the original, the technology of the day was advanced enough for Arnie, covered in slimy cold mud, to be able to infer that the Predator's vision is based on heat. But back in Native American times, there is no such thing as thermal vision anywhere in their world. It's not even a conceptual possibility. She gives Nice Translator Guy medicine that cools his body, the Predator doesn't see him, so she jumps to the conclusion, or at least she seems to have done. I may have misread this, but I'm pretty sure this is the conclusion she jumps to, like Arnie, that it can't see him because his body is cold. Now, it isn't impossible for her to make this leap in other ways, but it is catastrophically unlikely that she should even consider this one a possibility, as opposed to assuming that it couldn't see him because he wasn't moving and appeared to be dead, or because of some herbal property the medicine possessed, or any reason more naturalistic than, oh, the monster guy obviously has thermal goggles, whatever the fuck they are. It does spot Big Chief Goodboy, and he is about to kill it, but then Brother Warren rides in from nowhere on a horse and twats it in the head. The Predator obligingly fails to hit him off his horse. Now, just before we move on, I need to call attention to this scene because it becomes very relevant later. We see Brother Warren knocking the Predator's helmet off, we see its targeting computer activate, and we see Elizabeth Warren paying attention to it. I don't want to preempt the end, but this is the moment, blink and you miss it, that we're supposed to see Elizabeth Warren figuring out A, how the helmet works, and B, its relationship to the Predator's principal weapon, his homing spear gun thing. I won't say yet exactly how this becomes relevant, though if you've seen the film you already know, but I need to point it out because the mechanics of the final fight scene rely on this snatched glimpse of her snatched glimpse, to be precise. In this split second, in the middle of action, Elizabeth Warren learns something of vital mechanical importance. And this is another instance, of the film forgetting its time and its place and its setting. When at the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese were first introduced to the wonders of Western technology in the form of a model steam train, it was to them unfathomable brilliance. Some of the first samurai to see it were scared shitless, and others just became giddy children. None of them understood how the thing worked. It was so far beyond them that the idea it was technology at all just didn't occur. It's that old Arthur C. Clarke line, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It took decades, under close British and American tutelage, for the thing to be reverse engineered and for the Japanese to begin to learn what was, to the West, rudimentary mechanics. Predator tech is so much further ahead of Elizabeth Warren than model trains were to the pre-Meiji samurai. She should have had much more trouble with the pistol than she had. She shouldn't have been so quick to realize the link between body temperature and the Predator's vision, and that's if we accept she should ever have been able to make that link. But she absolutely should fucking not have been able to join these particular dots at all, and learn the fundamental workings of magical alien tech, having just caught a brief glimpse of it, such that she can be able to make use of that knowledge later on. This does recall a host of other problems, but if I were to sum them up briefly here, it's that events have no character consequence. She's not particularly fussed when she sees a space alien covered in blood holding a bear. She's not particularly fussed when all her tribe is violently murdered by same. Elizabeth Warren is a device, she is not a character. You can just bolt bits onto her, like a flintlock pistol or a fucking Predator helmet apparently, and like an action figure, everything just kind of clicks into place and works. Now, if you're feeling incredibly charitable, this all works if you just accept that this is the way the film is, and if you're prepared to turn your brain off. But it does require that you switch your brain off, and it does require that you accept that this film, which has a sole protagonist, remember, doesn't have a single character. And I think if we hadn't had our standards lowered to the floor by the last several installments in the franchise, we would not be as willing to accept this because it is not in fact good writing. Elizabeth Warren distracts it, Brother Warren somersaults over it and stabs it through the shoulder with a spear, which just doesn't bother it all that much, but it thinks it's outmatched and it activates its cloaking device. And this is Brother Warren's Billy moment. He tells Liz to run because it thinks he's the threat, not her, so she can escape. She stands there gormlessly, and it appears behind him and stabs him with its claws, which makes the entire sacrifice entirely redundant, not to mention anticlimactic, and not at all a fitting end for such a noble gesture. You can't do the run away, I'll lay down my life to buy us time thing, and then just yeet the guy seconds later. That robs him of any kind of meaningful end, it accomplishes nothing. But then the writers kind of realise this. Having complained about Elizabeth Warren's non-response to death earlier in this film, I am obliged to point out that she does react here for less than 2 seconds and soundlessly. Then the Predator advances on her, but despite being speared, Brother Warren manages to stab the Predator in the leg, which distracts it for a couple of seconds, and when it turns around, Elizabeth Warren is gone, meaning she must have teleported away because there is simply no way she could have escaped in so short a time, or even made it any meaningful distance without the Predator either spotting her, hearing her, or chasing her. But the film does another of its massive jump cuts, so we're not supposed to mind. She's cleaning herself up now at a river, while back in the village, news arrives that someone, or perhaps everyone, is dead. And again, the soundtrack in this film is fairly pleasing. It's unconventional, it's atmospheric, and it's meditative. It smooths the jump cuts wherever it's deployed, and it slows the pace down, which is necessary. And indeed, it's unfortunate they've not made more use of it, though it should also be said that in its Revenant-inspired moments, the film also understands the value of silence and the music of forests and rivers, which much of its soundtrack is designed to complement. For unknown reasons, though, we're then yanked away from this peaceful scene as Elizabeth Warren twats a random evil hairy colonizer drinking by the river. And in the next scene, again, fuck knows where they are, how much time has passed, how far they've gone, she's cut his leg off and she's let rats begin eating him alive, which is nice. This is the guy who captured and cut her brother up. And this is also clumsily done. She's given this guy an unloaded musket so the predator thinks he's a threat, not her, and it conveniently turns up to kill him. But to follow her, then doesn't it think she's a threat? And if it thinks she's a threat, then why would it not have killed her? If it didn't think she was a threat, why did it follow her? Why did she bank on it following her? So why did she set this elaborate trap up? I don't know. She's taken some of the potion to cool her body because it doesn't see her, it just walks right past her, allowing her to stand up behind it as it finishes off the evil hairy colonizer and shoot it in the head with a pistol, but the predator survives it. It survives being shot in the head. But it does lose its helmet thing, and this becomes very important later. And this scene has almost as many issues as Ezra Miller. Number one, the fact her body is cold does not mean it has no outline. As we saw quite clearly a couple of scenes ago, the potion does not conceal the French polyglot. It simply makes it look like he is dead. The outline of his body is clearly visible. But in this scene, the predator walks right by her as she's standing up. Dead bodies do not generally stand up. It would have seen her. Compounded then by two, she is standing by a fire. Fires are hot. She has just lowered her body temperature. This would have made her silhouette more pronounced. It would have seen her. Number three, the predator shows up mere seconds after she has ingested the potion, and the campfire is not concealed. For it to arrive so quickly after she had ingested the potion, it would have had to be within sight of the campfire when she'd taken it. It would have seen her. And you can't argue that it did see her but didn't consider her a threat, because if that were the case, there'd have been no need for her to ingest the potion to begin with. And in any case, it knows she's armed, it bothered to track her all the way here, it has no reason to believe she has discarded her weapon. Finally, number four, the predator has just been shot in the back of the head at point-blank range, and it survived. What the fuck? Anyway, this is all done to set up their final confrontation, which is fairly standard stuff. She sets up a few traps, one including the predator's helmet, and remember this, please remember this, because you won't believe how it becomes relevant in just a few minutes. The fight has many more flips and a lot more CGI than was available in the original film. It feels a good deal more weightless and less menacing. At no point does Elizabeth Warren ever seem at serious risk of losing. The original Predator beats the shit out of Arnie to the point of almost winning, but here the Predator just aggressively flails around as she outsmarts it constantly and beats it up and does her best to look fierce. She actually succeeds in cutting one of its arms off at one point. Actually, no, let's be specific because we need to appreciate the majesty? Yeah, that's a word, the majesty of this fight scene. More accurately, she gets the Predator to cut off its own arm. It gets its spikes impaled in a tree, she lunges at it with a spear, it activates its shield thing, and she deflects the shield to cut off the Predator's arm. It cut off its own fucking arm. And if that weren't bizarre enough, the other notable aspect of this fight is that there is a disappearing dog. Big Chief Goodboy, who's only ever in the plot when he needs to be, and otherwise just disappears, well, he does that here too. He jumps in to rescue her. Within the very next shot, he's disappeared. He was on the Predator's back and now he's just gone. He's not there. And he doesn't show up again at all until the end of the fight, when Big Chief Goodboy reappears at precisely the right moment with one of Elizabeth Warren's axes in its mouth and gives it to her. So essentially, Big Chief Goodboy acts as a summon in a video game. And this, again, is very fucking silly. Besides which, the Predator has immense amounts of plot armor. It's tanked stab wounds to the chest and shoulders and legs, it's tanked being shot in the fucking head, it's tanked having its arm cut off. But having cut off its own arm, been shot in the head, been severally stabbed and shot, and then been drowned in a swamp, do you want to know what finishes it off? Want to know how this amazingly choreographed, intricately planned fight scene ends? The Predator... Can't believe I'm about to say this. The Predator shoots itself in the head. I'm not joking. This actually happens. I had to rewatch it 3 times to make sure it really does happen. So how does this work? The Predator's helmet has its targeting computer. the targeting computer activates when it pulls out its big spear gun thing. Elizabeth Warren, remember, stuck the helmet in a random tree stump earlier. The predator emerges like the swamp thing and points the spear gun at her, which activates the targeting computer in its helmet on the tree, which happens to be pointing at the predator, which it doesn't notice. It fires its spear gun, the spear shoots out, it misses Elizabeth Warren, we get to see it as it does a wide loop through the trees, and then it flies back, and it impales the predator in the fucking head. The predator shot itself in the fucking head. This is a thing that did happen. How? How did Elizabeth Warren know that's how the helmet worked? How did she know that's how the spear gun worked? How did she know precisely where to place the helmet? How did the predator survive when she shot it in the head to get the helmet in the first place, but not survive being shot in the head here? How did the helmet still work after she'd shot it in the head? How did she manage to down the predator in the precise bit of the swamp that was in front of the helmet? How did the predator not realize that its spear gun wouldn't work properly without its helmet? What did it expect to happen when he fired it? Why didn't he make retrieving his helmet a mission objective, given his weapon doesn't work properly without it? Why, when he saw the spear doing its long arc through the woods, didn't he fucking duck? Why was this a thing? Who the fuck wrote this? Ugh, what's the point? Elizabeth Warren makes it back to the village with the predator's head. She brought nice translator man's pistol back with her, but apparently she didn't see the point in bringing any of the predator's much more deadly tech back. Don't you think an impregnable retractable shield, a super high-tech helmet attached to a homing spear gun, a cloaking device and whatever the fuck else it had on it might have been a bit more important than a stupid musket? Might have staved off a genocide if you'd had Native Americans armed with fucking predator tech in their fight against evil Whitey, no? And somehow that's the end of the film. Great. Well, in one sense I'm satisfied. I began it expecting it to be incredibly dumb, I was taken aback when the first half was actually quite good, but it seems there isn't a writing team employed anywhere in Hollywood that's capable of sustaining good sense and serious writing for more than half a script. Don't get me wrong, the fact half the film was at least decent automatically makes it so much better than any other offering in the recent and sorry history of the franchise. It boldly tried something different, and it treated the audience as adults, at least for a little while. It was significantly flawed in its opening, to be sure, characterization left a lot to be desired, dialogue was awful, frequent and massive jump cuts made it impossible to establish a sense of time and place, scenes felt disconnected, events had little if any character consequence, but for all that, in the first half, it did present a stripped-back, minimalist narrative that was at least cogent and mostly coherent. Combined with its soundtrack, its ever-sublime scenery, and its sometimes nifty camera work as well as its costume design, and the finer details of its world-building, the first half of Prey really did have quite a lot to recommend it. But it's like reviewing two different films, because from the halfway point the script devolved into inanity, cheap callbacks, lazy devices, becoming gradually more absurdist as it went on, and its cheap recourse to action-packed fight scenes was a transparent attempt to distract from its fraying story. And then, because it's so ridiculous we really do have to restate it, it culminated in a closing fight in which Elizabeth Warren was never in any serious peril, in which Big Chief Goodboy appeared and disappeared whenever the choreography demanded it, and in which the Predator cut off its own fucking arm and then shot itself in the head. That level of silliness really is worthy of the other later entries in the franchise. If we're feeling optimistic, if we're feeling charitable, the fact they were able to string half a good movie out of this is evidence there is some creativity left in writers' rooms somewhere. It's a kind of ironic incompetence that a half-decent film only saw a streaming service release, while all the others that are complete 100% unadulterated shite disgraced the theatres. But if we're being pessimistic, or perhaps, and I think I would prefer to say realistic, the fact it was only half-decent is itself quite damning. Because when you combine it with the absent character development and the disconnected episodic plot, it suggests that what the writers had here was a mere premise, Predator but with Native Americans, and no real story to tell or ideas to convey. In which case, while the film did successfully convey parts of its premise, the bare bones the writers were actually interested in, its story, or lack thereof, demonstrates all the flaws and the exact same foibles we would not forgive in another, somewhat less luscious production. Prey was superficially appealing, right up until the moment that it wasn't. But that's as much as can be said for it. I'm placing it in the category pretty shit film. It's pretty, but it is also very shit. Oh well, I'm sure there'll be another one in a few years, Though going back to where we began, I really do think it would be better if we just let it die and stay dead.